Okay, but let's get started here. So, welcome back. It was quite a snowy weekend, and I think today's attendance may be a little thin because of the ice storm, but let's get started anyway. So, a few announcements here. First is homework one is out. Okay, it's due week from tomorrow. So, you will have to upload it onto Moodle. Okay, so there's no need to turn in any handwritten, type it up and upload the homework onto Moodle. First announcement. Second announcement, lab groups. The first lab is going to be coming out soon. I had said that you can work on this lab by yourself or in groups of two. Okay? It's completely up to you if you want to form a group to decide who your project partner is. This is true for the in-class as well as the online students. If you need to look for a lab partner, I would recommend that you go to the news forum on Piazza and post saying I'm looking for somebody to do the project with me, and perhaps that's a good way to go and find somebody to work with. Okay, so do make use of the news forum. This is a good reason to go there and post asking for somebody you want to work with. Okay, that's the second announcement. Third announcement is the class participation. So, as I had mentioned in the syllabus, a small portion of the grade, roughly 5% of the grade, is for class participation. What that means is that you need to participate or ask questions. Typically, this class has been very silent, and by far the most silent class in at least 10 years, as far as I can remember. So, if things are not clear, you should be asking questions. I cannot believe that everything that I say is always easy and clear to understand. So, if you ask questions, you participate by default. Okay, and it's 5% of your grade. If I cannot remember you said anything in class at the end of the semester, you will not get that 5%. So, just for asking questions and making the class more understandable for yourself and others, there's a incentive for you to go and ask questions. Okay. The other aspect of class participation is to volunteer to take notes. There is a link on the course schedule, not the course schedule, the class schedule, which basically says notes. What I would like is if people volunteer to scribe, either by in class or looking at the video and produce the notes for a few lectures. I will also give you some credit for class participation. So if you're interested in volunteering for a few lectures, you don't have to do it for the whole semester. Each person can do maybe 2 or 3 lectures at the very most, and that should be good enough. I will provide a template that you can just fill out with the notes of what I said in the class, and we have to post it. Okay? If this is of interest, email me. I will make a schedule of which class or which lecture is assigned to which scribe, and we will go ahead from there. This is again true for in-class students and online students. You have the class lectures also posted, so you can go back and do that later as well. Okay. So those were a few announcements for the class. Let me actually continue our parable, which I promised we'll come back to. So this one is a continuation of what the story I had mentioned last time. This is the lion and the fox. So the story goes as follows. There's the lion in the forest who lives in a cave, and the lion is sitting outside the cave, and a fox comes along. Yeah, the fox seems very upset, and the lion says, "What happened?" And then the fox said, "I put my watch through the washing machine, so my watch is damaged and it needs to be repaired." So the lion says, "Let me take care of it." And then the fox says, "That is just not possible. Your paws are very big. This is a very delicate watch. It needs really fine amount of work. So how is it that you can fix my watch for me?" So the lion says, "Just give it to me and look." So then he goes in the cave, and after a while he comes out. The watch is fixed, and he hands it to the fox, and the fox is happy. And then a little while later, a wolf comes along. The wolf is upset, and the lion says, "So what happened?" And the wolf says, "My hard disk crashed, so I need to get my laptop fixed." And then the lion says, "I can do that for you." And And the wolf looks at the lion saying, that just doesn't seem possible. This is a really fine gadget. You need a lot of expertise to fix laptops. How is it that you can fix it? And then the lion says, watch. And he takes the laptop, goes in the cave, and he comes out, the laptop is fixed. Okay, so then a little while later, the lion goes into the cave, and inside the cave, there's a group of rabbits sitting with small tools trying to fix anything and everything that the lion wants them to fix. Okay, so the moral of the story is, it doesn't matter if you can prove theorems or write code. What matters is that the students can. Okay, so it's the opposite of what I said last time about picking good advisors, and this one is about having good students. Okay, so let's continue. We were talking about virtualization. Okay, so I'm going to do very quick recap. So I mentioned that virtualization is essentially mimicking of one interface using the other. We looked at virtualization at different levels in the stack. Okay, starting from hardware virtualization, OS virtualization, application virtualization, and so on. So then we looked at native virtualization as an example, okay? And I was talking about different types of hypervisors, and I specifically mentioned how type 1 hypervisors work. Okay. Now, the thing to keep in mind again is, I'm not sure whether people have got every bit that I was saying last time. Okay. To understand how type 1 hypervisor works, you need to, as I said last time, you need to understand how CPU is designed. Okay. Typically, any processor that you pick can operate in two modes, a user mode and a kernel mode. Okay. And typically, they're either called user mode or kernel mode or rings. So you can have ring 0 being the kernel mode and ring 1 or ring 3 being the user mode. Okay. The difference between these two modes is the following. So if you have a list of assembly instructions the CPU can execute, okay, some set of these assembly instructions can only be executed in kernel mode. Okay. And the rest can be executed in user or kernel mode. Okay. The instructions in kernel modes are the instructions that do something to the hardware. You cannot trust the user to have user programs to execute those instructions, so only the kernel can execute them. Okay. So those instructions can only be executed in kernel mode. The standard instructions you can execute in either mode. And the assumption is typically when the OS is executing, the CPU is in kernel mode. When user programs execute, the CPU is in user mode. There's usually a bit, okay, this is sort of the mode bit that you set or reset, depending on the value of the bit indicates whether you're in kernel mode or user mode. So when the kernel runs, it sets the bit to 1. So the CPU switches to kernel mode. It allows executing the entire instruction set. If the bit is not set, you're in user mode, only these instructions can be executed. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Okay. Typically on a normal machine, okay, you only have the kernel and user programs. Okay, so the kernel executes in kernel mode, the user programs execute in user mode. When you are in virtualized world, okay, you have the hypervisor, okay, and then you have virtual machines, and inside each virtual machine is an OS and program. So in this case, the hypervisor is the one executing in kernel mode. Okay. User programs and the entire virtual machine, which includes the OS on that virtual machine and the user programs, execute in user mode. Okay. So now, although the kernel is now executing inside the virtual machine in user mode, it is still going to execute all of the instructions that it would normally have executed if there was no virtualization, which includes even the kernel mode instructions. Okay? But because the OS is executing in user mode here, okay, when you execute those instructions, the CPU will say, this is in user mode, I cannot let those instructions execute, because I only let those instructions execute if you are in the kernel mode, which only the hypervisor can, not operating system kernels that are inside virtual machines. Okay, so we looked at how you can actually enable that function. So what we said essentially is, if you have these instructions, okay, if kernel mode instructions also cause a trap, then you can make this work. Okay, so what would happen is, let's say this virtual machine is executing. It is going to, the OS and its application processes are going to execute in user mode. Okay? Let's say the process here makes a system call. You go to the kernel starts executing. It tries to execute a kernel mode instruction. Because you are in user mode, you will not be able to execute it. Okay. Now, if this instruction also raises a trap, okay, then what will happen is that trap is essentially an interrupt. Interrupt will cause the hypervisor to start running. Whenever you raise a trap, you jump into an interrupt service routine. So that's typically handled by the hypervisor. Okay, so you switch to the hypervisor, and when you switch to the hypervisor enters starts running in kernel mode. Okay. So as part of executing that interrupt, okay, the hypervisor will say, here is an OS that's trying to execute some kernel mode instruction. It does not have the privileges to do it. So the hypervisor, will execute it on behalf of that kernel. Okay? Is that clear? Is that so? So basically, yes, your question.
That would mean a malicious user level program could execute hardware instructions which generate the same trap, and the hypervisor would execute that for the.
Yes. So that's a good point. The point is that since you allowed this to happen, why is it not possible for user programs to directly start executing kernel mode instructions, cause the hypervisor to execute something on behalf of the process and cause something malicious? Right. So that's a very good observation. I will come back to that in just 1 second. Okay. So that basically says you need a way to distinguish between user mode kernels and user mode processes. Okay. At the moment, we are just treating them all the same, but you're right, if you treat them that way, then you will have a security problem, which we will have to deal with. Okay. But it's important to understand what's going on. So you have the OS that's running in user mode, it's trying to execute something, it's a kernel mode instruction, you don't have the privileges, you trap, the hypervisor does that for you. Okay. That's the only way it will work. So basically, if you look at what we said here, we said that you want the kernel mode instruction, which are sensitive instruction, to cause a trap. If your CPU does not support this feature, which is when you execute this kernel mode instruction, they do not cause a trap, then you cannot implement type 1 hypervisor. In particular, the Intel architectures until recently ignored kernel mode instructions that were executed in user mode. If you are a user program and you try to execute a kernel mode instruction, it will just ignore it, saying you cannot do it. It will just turn it into a no-op instruction, which means it's completely ignored. Okay. If this is the case, there is no way for the guest OS to signal to the hypervisor saying, I'm executing this kernel mode instruction, please do it for me. Okay. So you could not support type 1 virtualization, okay, with the default Intel architecture. What they have done now is they have this thing called notion of this hardware virtual machine. So Intel has a support called VT, virtualization technology, and AMD has a SVM virtual machine, where you can set a bit vector. It says for these instructions, if they execute in user mode, raise a trap. So you can turn those set once for all of the kernel instructions in that bit map, okay, dynamically. And then if a user program, i.e. the kernel running in user mode, executes this instruction, it will cause a trap. Right? So if you have a VT-enabled processor, Intel processor, or SVM-enabled AMD processor, you can implement type 1 hypervisor. If you take any old processor, you cannot. You will run this virtual machine and the OS will start executing something, all instructions will be ignored, and your entire virtual machine will crash. Okay? So this is something to keep in mind. Okay, now we'll come back to the question that Sandeep was saying. If you allow this virtual machine to start triggering kernel mode instruction and trap to the hypervisor, there is no way for the hypervisor to know whether the instruction was executed by the kernel or a process that's running inside on top of the kernel. Okay? So there has to be a way to distinguish between a guest OS and processes that run on top of the guest OS. So this is typically done by having additional protection layers. So user and kernel distinction is no longer enough. Okay? You want something in between which says, so this says not trusted. Okay, this is fully trusted. Okay, you want something in between which is neither completely untrusted nor fully trusted. Okay, so this is the way this is done is you have multiple protection levels. Okay? So this is just typical CPUs will have at least two, user and kernel, but most CPUs will have more than two, which have increasing levels of trust. Okay? So this is called ring 0, which means the maximum level of trust, and user programs run in ring 3, which is the least trust or no trust whatsoever. But there is ring 1 and ring 2 in between, which allows you to say I trust whatever is running in that protection level more than what I would trust a completely untrusted program. Okay? So what would happen is the guest OS will actually run in ring 1, which means it is trusted more. But now you can also distinguish between you guest OS running and processes running. So you basically then only let something that's more trusted execute this instruction and trap them. Yes, question there.
Okay, but if you totally trusted the virtual operating system, right, and it was not, I don't know if it was secure and whatnot, then the virtual user mode would provide this automatically or not?
If you completely trusted the OS, can you just use user mode and kernel mode and that's it? Is that the
No,
question?
I guess there was a stack, right, where like the virtual OS and the virtual user space are in the actual user space.
Yes, everything above this is user land. Everything below this is kernel mode. Is that the stack that you're referring to?
Yeah, I guess if you had the virtual operating system, right? Like
Yeah.
if that was secure and unexploitable, then you wouldn't expect that an application running in the virtual operating system would be able to gain, like, to execute.
So your question is if the process is, if the OS is to be trusted, then will you allow a process to gain access to the hypervisor? That's your question, correct?
No.
No.
No, sorry. It's not. It's not very important.
Okay. So maybe I can answer that question that I thought you were asking, although that's not what you were asking. So the point is, let's forget the hypervisor for now, right? So you just have an OS. Okay, and let's assume that it's well built, it's trusted and whatnot, and then your user processes that are untrusted, that can do arbitrary things, malicious things, or just have bugs in them. Okay? And you don't want to do, and you don't want to compromise safety, which means you can't let a user process crash the kernel or take over the machine. You know, that's sort of the way you basically design this object. Now the point is, if you could have, so since you allow processes to do whatever they want, they could try to execute kernel mode instructions as well. But typically the OS will figure this out and say that you are not allowed to do this and terminate the program. Because if it causes a trap, you'll go into the kernel will say you don't have privileges to do this, and your process will crash, saying you try to execute something that you are not allowed, or you try to access a memory region that doesn't belong to you, you get a segmentation fault and you crash. Okay? So this is how protection is typically implemented. Okay. Now, if you had a virtualized world, when you cause the trap, as far as the hypervisor is concerned, it just sees a trap. It doesn't have visibility inside the virtual machine, so it doesn't know whether the OS executed that instruction or a process inside that on top of that OS executed that instruction. Which is why you need to be able to distinguish between the guest OS and processes running on that OS. Okay, that's what you are asking, right? So you need to have multiple levels of protection to do this well. Yeah, this is why you have these rings of protection. Any questions here?
You said that if the hardware doesn't trap for kernel mode instructions, then type 1 hypervisor can't be implemented. Is it the same for the type 2 hypervisor?
Okay. Question is, so we said, if you don't have some hardware support, you can't do type 1. Can you implement type 2? Answer is yes. I'll show you how to do that on the next slide. Okay. So just wait for type 2. Are there any questions on type 1? Yes.
How do the hypervisor deals with ring 1 interrupts?
How do hypervisors deal with ring 1 interrupts?
Does it know whether it was from ring
Yes,
1?
I think it will know, because you will basically know where basically you have this protection bit, right? It says, are you in ring 0, 1, 2, 3? Right? So when you cause an interrupt, you can see where the interrupt, which ring it came from. Okay, so you can figure out who did that, who caused that interrupt, so just by looking at that. Yes. Any other questions? Yes, you have to have all of that. So as you can imagine, you need to know a little bit about computer architectures and processor sets to understand this, but I think I've given enough background here. So if you need any more clarifications, let me know. I will also give a handout on virtualization. This material is not in the textbook, but I have a handout that I'm going to give out where all of this is explained well. Okay? Alright, so let us move on. So this is the same explanation that I was providing. So you have type 1 hypervisor, guest OS, processes. guest OS executes kernel mode instruction, traps, the hypervisor does whatever it needs to do. And you need some hardware support, i.e. you need some VT support to enable interrupts for kernel mode instructions for this to work. Okay, so let's now move on to type 2 hypervisors. Okay, so type 2 hypervisors, let's go back to the first picture so it's clear what's going on. Okay. The type 1 hypervisor runs on bare metal. That's type 2 hypervisor. You already have an OS running on your machine. Okay. Your virtual machine hypervisor actually runs as a user process. Okay. This is what I'd shown last time. You may have VMware running on your desktop. Okay. And VMware is actually running as a process itself, user level process. Okay. So in this case, the hypervisor is not trusted like you do here. Okay. This kernel is the one that's actually trusted because that's running on bare metal. Okay. Only the kernel is going to run in kernel mode. Everything above it runs in user mode, including the hypervisor, the guest OS that runs on the hypervisor, and user processes. Okay. So you have no privileges for your hypervisor or the guest OS or processes. So you need to implement type 2 hypervisors in a completely different way. You can't use this technique anymore because the hypervisor is basically just a user process. And so is the guest OS and so on the processes. So question is, what can we do? Yeah, what happens when the guest OS tries to execute a kernel mode instruction? Okay. Here, when the guest OS executed a kernel mode instruction, we caused a trap. We made the hypervisor execute that for you. Okay. We no longer have that luxury here. Okay. The guest OS only talks to the hypervisor. They are all running in user space. Guest OS will execute some kernel mode instruction because it thinks it's running on hardware. The guest OS doesn't know it's actually running on emulated virtual machine. It thinks it's running on real hardware, so it will continue to behave the same as if you are actually running it on a real hardware. Okay. So somehow we need an ability for the guest OS to continue to execute its kernel mode operations. Okay. The question is, how do we do it? Okay. Any thoughts here? I will go back to the slide. There are a few different techniques to do this, okay, but they all require you to dynamically modify the instructions on the fly. Okay. There is no tricks you can play to cause interrupts anymore because all the interrupts are coming from user level processes. There's nothing you can do. Okay. The only thing you can actually do is have the hypervisor actually scan the instructions as they're executing or as they're about to execute. Okay. And anytime you find a kernel mode instruction that's about to get executed, you have to actually replace that on the fly with a function call that you make to the hypervisor. Okay. Somehow you have to signal the hypervisor. In the previous case, you used an interrupt. You executed that kernel mode instruction, it caused an interrupt. That mechanism is not available anymore. So what happens is the hypervisor, as the guest OS or the processes are actually executing code, the hypervisor dynamically scans the code. Then anytime it actually sees a sensitive instruction, it replaces that instruction with a function call to the hypervisor. Okay. So what now? So in other words, you are dynamically changing the code of the kernel on the fly, replacing every kernel mode instruction with a function call to the hypervisor. Okay. So rather than, so if the process says go do I/O, makes a system call read or write which triggers I/O. Okay, underneath the kernel will try to execute some instruction that is a kernel mode instruction. So hypervisor will come in and replace that with a function call. What that function call will essentially do is rather than executing that kernel mode instruction, you execute this function call. Function call simply calls the hypervisor saying go do this I/O for me. And what the hypervisor will do is it in turn will trigger another system call to the real OS. Okay, so this one. Okay, so this code is changed on the fly. You replace kernel mode instruction by functions. The function executes now rather than the kernel mode instructions calls the hypervisor saying do this thing for my process. The hypervisor actually makes a system call if needed to the OS and saying go do this. And then the actual host operating system will execute whatever the hypervisor is asking it to execute. Okay? So it requires what is called binary translation of code. You are actually changing assembly instructions of the kernel, the OS kernel on the fly, replacing anything that is sensitive or a kernel mode instruction with function calls to the hypervisor. Okay. So as you can imagine, this is going to slow you down because you are doing instruction translation on the fly. Okay. But that's the only way to make it work. But the advantage of doing this is there is no support needed at the hardware level. Okay, so you can run type 2 hypervisors even on old processors. There's no VT support needed, none of that. Okay, because you're simply changing the code on the fly and then you just use eventually the normal system call mechanism. The hypervisor calls the underlying host operating system. Okay, so sensitive instructions replaced by procedures that emulate them. Okay? All right. Any questions on this type 2 hypervisor? So type 1 hypervisor requires some hardware support, type 2 hypervisor doesn't, but then you have more of a performance penalty to pay them because you're doing binary translation. Okay. Here we'll now look at para-virtualization, which is a different technique but uses ideas from type 2 hypervisors. Okay. So a para-virtualization is another technique to run a guest operating system on top of a type 1 hypervisor but without requiring any hardware level support. Right? Normally if you want to do this, we said you need hardware level support. You need VT or some such technology which will cause a trap whenever a kernel mode instruction is required. Okay? So without that hardware support, you cannot do type 1 hypervisors as we have looked at it. Okay? Now para-virtualization is a way to implement a type 1 hypervisor without requiring any hardware support. So the way this works is we now assume that you can go and modify the operating system. Okay. Until now we assume that the OS is unmodified. You can take stock Windows, you can take a Windows install disk, just install it on a type 1 hypervisor, so long there's hardware support, it will run. Okay. But you need hardware support. Okay. If you don't want that hardware support or dependency on that hardware support, here is what you can do. You can essentially do whatever type 2 hypervisor was doing, which is modify the kernel code, but you actually have a programmer do this ahead of time, not do this on the fly. Okay. So if you are a kernel designer, you could design a version of Linux, okay, as an example as is shown here, that is designed to run on a type 1 hypervisor. What you would do is you will actually look at the kernel code, the source code, and anytime you see the kernel implementing anything that requires you to execute kernel instruction, you modify that with a function call. Okay. Exactly what was done here, but here this translation was happening at runtime on the fly. The hypervisor was doing the translation. Okay. In this case, a programmer will actually create a special version of the kernel where you have done that translation in source code. Okay. You have actually gone and looked at the source code. Anytime the kernel is doing something sensitive, you say, since you are running in virtualized mode, you cannot execute this instruction. So I'm going to replace that with a call to the hypervisor. Because we call this call hypercalls. Yeah. Just as your system calls, these are calls to the operating system. Hypercalls are calls to the hypervisor. Every sensitive instruction gets replaced by a hypercall. Okay. Now you compile that kernel. This is a modified version of a normal, in this case, a normal Linux kernel, a stock kernel, a special version that you build just to run on hypervisors. Now, in this case, you can just run this without any hardware support. So there are no sensitive instructions left or kernel mode instructions left in that kernel anymore. You will just replace them with hypercalls. Okay, so whenever the process on that modified Linux makes a system call, this will basically come to the kernel. The kernel will make a hypercall to the type 1 hypervisor. Type 1 hypervisor still runs in kernel mode, so it's fully trusted, so it can execute all those instructions on behalf of the guest OS and the processes that are running in that guest OS. Okay, so this is referred to as para-virtualization. So this basically says that on the advantages, you don't need any hardware support. The disadvantage is it requires you to modify the operating system, okay, to remove any sensitive instructions from kernel code and replace them with hypercalls. Okay. Now clearly this can be only done if you have access to the OS source code. So it has been done for Linux because that's open source. You cannot say I'm implementing a type 1 hypervisor, I'm going to create a para-virtualized version of Windows because Windows source code is proprietary, it's not open source. Microsoft can do it, but a hypervisor designer cannot have access to it. So it only works if you have access to the source code, and it requires you to actually go modify the source. If you do all of that, then you remove that dependency. Okay, so there are para-virtualized hypervisors. Examples being Zen is an example of such a hypervisor. There was VMware had a ESX server that was para-virtualized at one point. The reason was they wanted the ability to run on older server processors that did not have all of this support. Because the old Intel CPUs did not support any type of type 1 hypervisors because they just ignored all kernel mode instructions executing in user mode. Okay, is that clear? What para-virtualization is? Yes.
Is there a restriction that prevents you from doing what you do type 2 hypervisors and on the fly instruction translation para-virtualization?
Question, is there any restriction that prevents you from doing what you did in type 2 hypervisors? Could you not have, rather than modifying the OS code, actually gone and replaced it on the fly? There are few more restrictions, and basically in type 2 hypervisors, because this is a process, it is actually watching the instructions here as it's running on the fly and doing all the translation. In type 1 hypervisors, you basically just let the OS run. You don't actually watch it instruction by instruction and let it do what you want. Only when you're executing kernel mode instruction do you create a trap or a hypercall. Okay? So the architectures are built differently. Okay? If you wanted to do that, you would actually have to let the guest operating system run instruction by instruction and watch it. It's almost like running it in a debugger, where the debugger actually watches every instruction of your executing program, and you can have breakpoints and so on. It's somewhat slow. So that kind of technology has actually not been used in type 1 hypervisors simply because the whole reason of running it on bare metal was you want efficiency. You want the OS to directly run natively without having to look at every instruction. If you're looking at every instruction, you may as well run it as type 2. Why bother? Right? So I think there is no technical reason not to do it, but the reason type 1 hypervisors exist are for efficiency. Type 2 hypervisors are not very efficient. They have to do all of that translation. Yes.
So in this case, is para-virtualization more efficient than type 2 hypervisor?
Is para-virtualization more efficient? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yes. So as you can imagine, para-virtualization will be more efficient for two reasons. First of all, there is no translation on the fly. You made all the changes at before at the source code. You have compiled the kernel, it's just going to run. There's nothing to translate. Okay, that's number one. Number two, you are basically running on type 1 hypervisors. Okay? It's running on bare metal, so you can actually natively run on the processor without actually having any translations and so on. In type 2 hypervisors, you have one more layer, which is the host operating system. Okay, so you have the host operating system, you have the hypervisor, you have the guest operating system. As you add each layer, the overhead will go up. Okay? Any other questions on this? So that's para-virtualization. Now we'll talk a little bit. So I only talked about how do you deal with processors, okay? So as a resource when you virtualize or build a virtualization layer. This virtualization layer actually needs to deal with every resource on your machine, not just the processor. There is memory, there is disk, there are network interfaces. All of those need to be virtualized. Okay? So thus far what I have actually discussed or described is just how do you deal with the CPU in virtualized environments. Okay? So you have to apply similar concepts of virtualization to other resources. I'll only talk about memory and very briefly about I/O and networks, but not go into the same level of depth as to how do you go and virtualize memory and so on. Okay. So memory virtualization problem is as follows. So basically on the hardware, you have RAM. So now multiple VMs will actually reside in memory. Okay, so you may have virtual machine 1, virtual machine 2, VM 3, so now the hypervisor. this hypervisor needs to allocate memory to each virtual machine. There's an OS that runs inside each virtual machine. This OS doesn't actually know it only has access to a region of RAM. So OS is basically, it thinks it's actually running on real hardware and it has full control of the memory as it normally would. Okay? So somehow you have to give the illusion to this OS saying it has access to only, first of all, your card or RAM, and to this OS this looks like this is the entire RAM on that machine, not the whole thing. Okay? So each OS only thinks it has, believes that this is the RAM on the machine. Okay? And as you can imagine, as the OS thing, it will basically address this region of memory from 1 through n, even though the physical addresses are not starting at 0 at that location. Okay. So essentially you have to virtualize RAM, carve it out into pieces, allocate each smaller chunk to a virtual machine, and that virtual machine believes that that's actually RAM, real, it looks like physical RAM, so address exactly the same as it would address real RAM, which is start from address 0 and go through n, even though that's not really 0 at all, you've given it some arbitrary region in RAM. Okay. And so that's how you will make all of this transparent to the operating system. Okay. So the hypervisor needs to deal with all of this translation. It needs to look at whatever addresses are being generated and translate them to real physical addresses. Okay. The hypervisor needs to deal with page table mappings as well. Okay. Within each, the OS actually manages page tables on behalf of all of the processes. The page table data structure tracks what pages of memory are allocated to which process. Okay, so each process has a page table which says this is my page 1 and this is page 2 and this is page 3 and so on. Okay. So that's a data structure that the OS manages for every process that's running on top of that OS. Okay. Typically, manipulating page tables require manipulating hardware at some level, and these are kernel mode operations. These operations cannot be done by user processes. You can only do this as kernel mode operation. So in this case, if the guest operating system tries to muck around with hardware page tables, it will not have the privileges to do that. Okay? You have to ask the hypervisor to do it on your behalf. Because you know you the guest OS are running in user mode. Okay? Maybe ring 1 or some such thing. Okay? So again, you basically need a hypervisor that will allow you to modify page tables, okay, but not let the OS do it that modification directly. It has to basically, that call has to come down to the hypervisor. Okay, so what is done here is actually there are the hypervisor maintains what are called shadow page tables. Okay, so there's a copy of the page table that the hypervisor manages, okay, and then there's a copy of the page table that the OS manages, and these are sort of, you can think of them as one-to-one mappings. Okay. So if this OS tries to modify this page table, that triggers a trap. That's a sensitive instruction. Cause a trap, the hypervisor will actually make a modification and reflect these changes in the real page table, because this is just a mirrored copy. Okay. So you basically modify this and make that modification will be reflected here. The OS will think it actually made the modification, although it doesn't even have the privileges to do this. So you have to play these kinds of tricks. You have to map actual page table to the shadow page table. When the OS tries to modify that page table, you actually cause a trap, and the hypervisor makes those modifications and reflect those changes into the OS's page table, and so on and so forth. Okay. Similarly, you have to deal with page faults in the same way. Page faults are interrupts. Process may trigger a page fault. The OS has to handle it, but really it's going to be handled by the underlying hypervisor. But that requires additional privileges that the OS does not have. Okay. Same kind of concepts would apply here. Okay. We are not going to go into the detail of exactly how you make this modification and so on. The thing to keep in mind is the hypervisor needs to provide an illusion to each virtual machine as if the memory allocated to the virtual machine is the entire RAM on that machine, and that you can address that memory starting from 0 as if you are addressing real RAM. Any modifications to OS level data structure, memory management data structures, whether it's TLBs, page tables, handling page faults, all of those have to be handled by the hypervisor on behalf of the OS, because they are all privileged or kernel mode operations. Okay, so if you do this, then you can also deal with memory just as you dealt with processing. Okay. but very different resources need different kinds of mechanisms to handle. Okay. That's all I'm going to say as far as memory virtualization goes. Okay, we'll not go into detail here, but I can take questions if you need any clarifications. Yes.
Is this resource allocation static?
Is this resource allocation static? So there are multiple levels of resources here. First is amount of RAM allocated to a virtual machine. Second is amount how page tables allocate memory to processes inside a virtual machine. Clearly, the page tables are dynamic. Processes come and go. And you can start a process on your machine and you can terminate the process. Same is true inside the virtual machine. You can start windows, you can start browsers, you can quit them. As you start a process, new page tables get allocated. As you remove processes, the page tables go. Okay, so these data structures are all dynamic. As far as RAM allocated to a machine is concerned, there are two ways to think about it. First is that for most operating systems, this RAM allocation is static. So you can say, if I have 4 gig of RAM, you want to create a virtual machine, give it 1 gig. Okay, so this 1 gig can be allocated. Now there are some virtual machine hypervisors that even allow you to change the memory allocated to a OS on the fly, or they can actually change the memory allocation on the fly. So one thing they do is what is called overbooking of memory. Okay. So you tell the kernel saying you have been given 1 gig of RAM, okay, but then you overbook. So rather, if you have 4 GB, rather than running 4 virtual machines, each being given 1, you actually run 5. Okay, so now you are committed. You have told each kernel you have given them 1 GB. So you are actually committed to allocating 5 gigabytes, although the machine has only 4. Okay. But because you are doing all the translation underneath, you can hide that overbooking from the kernel. And what you are trying to take advantage of is typically when you have allocated memory, there is some free space remaining, which is unused. Okay. So rather than leaving it unused, you overbook. And you assume that not all kernels need their entire max allocation at the same time. If you make that assumption and that assumption is true, you will win. You can actually run more virtual machines than your physical RAM allows you to. Okay. Just as inside, if you know what virtual memory is, on OS, virtual memory allows you to run more processes than your physical RAM because it uses disk as a backing store for memory. You can play the same kind of tricks here. Okay, you can modify the actual allocation on the fly. I mean, the max allocation is 1 GB, but at any time you may have given it 700 megabytes because that's enough for those. If it needs increases, you may take some RAM from one OS and give it to the other. Okay. And all the mapping is done internally. Okay, so you are translating the addresses on the fly, so you can manage the mapping as you wish. Okay. So those are all advanced features. I was not planning to go into them here, but because the question was asked, I just want to point out that by virtualizing, you can play all of these things. You can change the allocation on the fly. You can overbook resources and run more virtual machines. In fact, VMware actually does this. It says that you may have limited RAM, but their product will allow you to run more virtual machines than RAM would normally allow by overcommitting memory. Okay. Other hypervisors don't. They say static allocation. If you say 1 GB, you must allocate 1 GB. We are not going to let you allocate less than that. In that case, you can only run as many virtual machines as the amount of RAM you have. Okay. Once you run out of RAM, you cannot run more VMs. Okay. So different hypervisors do different things. Okay, so last point here is I/O virtualization. So you also have to virtualize the network interface as well as the disks on your machine. Same kind of technique is true. So basically, the illusion you have is you have one large physical disk, and there are VMs running here. Okay. The storage space on this disk is somehow partitioned and allocated to each of these virtual machines. Okay. Each virtual machine thinks that it's actually accessing a physical disk. Okay. This is done by creating a virtual disk abstraction. So you basically have a virtual disk and you allocate it some space, okay, which is some fraction of your physical disk, and this virtual disk will be accessed by the virtual machine. Okay. And all of the translation from addresses of the virtual disk to the addresses on the real disk is actually done by the hypervisor. Okay. Virtual disks can be implemented in many ways. You can actually create physical partitions on your disks. You know what C drive, D drive, you have partitions on the disk, or in Linux you have different disk partitions. You can create partitions and allocate the partitions to virtual machine, and that partition looks like a virtual disk to the virtual machine. Or the entire virtual disk can be a file on your file system. You can just create a large file. Let's say you can create a 10 gigabyte file, and that file, although it's actually a file at the host operating system level, to the virtual machine it looks like a raw disk. Okay, so rather than reading and writing blocks, you are reading and writing to this file. Okay. If you have actually done VMware or anything such thing, you know what a virtual disk file looks like. It just looks like a large file on your disk. Okay. So regardless of the mechanism used, the main idea here is you want to take the storage space on your physical disk, carve it out and allocate that storage space to each virtual machine and give the abstraction of a virtual disk. Okay. Same is true of a network interface card. Okay, the machine also has a physical machine. It has an Ethernet card. Okay, that is used to do network I/O. Right? And there's only one Ethernet card typically. Maybe you have more on servers, but let's assume there is only one. Each of these virtual machines needs to do network I/O. So somehow each of these would have to share the resources here. Okay, the way this is done is you create logical interfaces, logical network interfaces, and multiplex them onto the physical interface. So each of them is given a logical Ethernet adapter. This is a virtual adapter, not a real card. Just an emulation of an Ethernet card. Okay. So each virtual machine is going to read and write to its logical card. The packets, the network packets, are actually multiplexed or sent to the actual physical card by the hypervisor. Okay, so when you write here, those packets are actually sent through the physical interface. When packets arrive here, the hypervisor figures out which virtual machine is this packet for, and it delivers it to the right one. Okay, and then it arrives at the logical interface here, and the logical interface will hand it to the processor. Okay, is that clear? What we just said. So all the interfaces are multiplexed, the disk resources are multiplexed, memory resources are multiplexed. So you have to keep all of that in mind. So essentially, the basic thing is you have all these hardware resources on a physical machine. You take a slice of each of those resources. So you are essentially slicing each resource, whether it's memory, disk, processor, and giving a fraction of this resource to each virtual machine. And the virtual machine basically runs with some fractional resource on the physical side. Okay. So that's all I have to say as far as native virtualization is concerned. Okay, so although we have spent a little bit of time, keep in mind that there is only one form of virtualization, okay, which is you are virtualizing the hardware. As I mentioned, you could do the same thing at the operating system level, at the application level, and so on, yielding different virtualization at different levels in the stack. Okay, I'm not going to talk about every one, just every level. Just want to mention application level virtualization. Okay. So when I described this last time, I mentioned that Java is an example of this. The Java virtual machine is an example of virtualization at the application level. Okay. So there is a JVM abstraction, that's the Java virtual machine. It's an abstract machine. Okay. It has a certain API that it exposes to any Java program. And then you basically implement the JVM using the underlying interfaces or libraries. So you may write your JVM in C. In this case, you are using the C library interfaces to export a JVM interface. Yeah, as I said, you have to use one interface to create another one. So in Java, you are basically using presenting the JVM interface. So that's basically the way it works in Java. There are many other forms of process level virtualization. I mentioned Rosetta as an example. Okay. Rosetta was this technology that Apple introduced in Mac OS when they switched from PowerPC processor to Intel processors. They needed the ability to let you run your PowerPC application. So this is an application level process that is translating PowerPC instructions into equivalent Intel instructions. So many forms of application level virtualization, and I think the thing to keep in mind is Java is the most common one. Okay? The interesting thing about Java is it basically your code runs regardless of the underlying hardware or the OS platform. So long as you are running on some version of the JVM and you know that your code runs on Java 5 or whatever, it's going to run on that JVM no matter what the underlying platform, whether it's Windows or Linux. Once you write the code, it runs anywhere. The reason for this is you are writing it to an abstract interface. That interface hasn't changed regardless of the underlying interface. So your code is portable. Just as when IBM introduced virtualization for mainframes for portability, saying old code or code designed to run on one interface will run on newer hardware. Same is true of Java. You write it once, it will run on newer hardware, other platforms, etc. Okay, so if you do this, you will also get portability. Virtualization gives you portability is the other advantage of it. Okay, so a few other points and then we are going to switch to a different topic. So one is virtual machine appliances and multiple cores. Okay, if you have actually used virtual machines in any shape or form, you will know that one advantage of virtualization is it allows you to download pre-packaged virtual machines. Okay. So somebody has created a virtual machine. They have installed software in there, whether it's an OS, they may have also installed some applications, configured the applications, okay, and deployed this as a downloadable package called an appliance. Okay. So if you want to now install that application, all you have to do is download that entire package, appliance, and run it as a virtual machine. Okay. So because it's already configured for you, or it just runs, there's no need to reconfigure your application, none of that. It just runs inside the virtual machine and you're ready to go. Right? So virtual machines have become a popular way to distribute complex applications that require a lot of configuration. So some expert somewhere, maybe the vendor of that product, where there is expertise, actually configures it all and distributes it as a virtual machine rather than distributing it on a CD. In the normal way, you download the software, you install it, you configure it, and you have to read a manual to figure out how to configure it. So there's a lot of complexity. Right? If software is distributed as an appliance, somebody else has done all of that for you. You just install the virtual machine and it's ready to run. You just run it, the process or application runs inside the virtual machine and you can do whatever you need to do. Okay? So that's a lot of virtual machine appliances that you can find. If you go to the VMware website, there is something called VMware Marketplace. If you go there, you will see that there are hundreds and hundreds of different appliances people have put up. You can download Apache. You can download a variety of different kinds of software you can get normally, but now distributed in the appliance. Okay. So basically, advantage is you can do software distribution using virtual machine appliances rather than the old way. It eliminates the need for any expertise at the user end to configure that application. Get pre-configured, ready to run. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention was having multiple cores on your servers has also made it attractive to run virtual machines. So there are lots of processor resources. So you can get 4-core machine laptops. You can even get 4 quad-core phones for that matter. Okay. So the number of cores on machines is continuing to grow. Okay. There has to be good ways to use it. One way to use this is to actually use virtual machines and run different VMs on different cores. Okay. You can run, rather than slicing a single CPU across virtual machines, you can take cores and assign them to virtual machines. You can say this VM runs on core 3. So all the resources on your core 3 are given to that virtual machine. You can run another virtual machine on another core. You can assign multiple cores to a machine. So this kind of technology has made it very useful to allocate resources in the form of cores to virtual machines. And this is often used in data centers, which I will mention on the next slide, in server environment, where you can buy 16 core servers typically. So in many cases, there aren't very many applications that are so compute intensive that they need all the 16 cores. So one popular way to use the resources on the server is run a type 1 hypervisor. Create lots of smaller virtual machines. And inside each virtual machine, you basically run a separate OS and separate set of applications. So you can run would have to have by n machines in the old days. You can consolidate all of them on one larger server today because you have lots of cores and lots of resources on that server. Okay, so that's use of virtualization. So I already was talking about data centers. Okay, so server consolidation is a popular application of virtualization. Okay, so every 4 or 5 years, as your servers become older, okay, you will basically decommission those servers, buy newer servers. But newer servers have lot more resources than the old server. So there is no reason to replace one old server with one new server. Okay? In fact, you can take 3 old servers or 4 old servers and pack them into one newer server. And the way to pack them is you simply take whatever was running on one old server, you take all of that code, you construct a virtual machine of it, and you run that virtual machine on the new server. So it still looks like an old server, the same server, but it is now running inside a virtual machine. Okay. So this way you can save money because if you had 100 old servers, maybe you replace them with 20 new servers. Each has lots of cores, but then you pack them using virtual machines onto smaller. So now you have fewer machines to manage. That's less expensive. You don't have as many machines to deal with. Your cost has gone down. Okay? So you don't have to do one-to-one replacement. You can do many-to-one packing. Okay? So saves hardware cost, save power and cooling costs. So you have less servers to deal with. And that's one very popular example. This is why virtualization has become very popular in the enterprise environment, because this is essentially what they do. Okay? Even in this department, basically some old machines are being replaced, they are becoming virtualized. Okay? The web server that we used to have is gone. Okay? Now it's basically packaged as a virtual machine, is actually virtualized. Okay? And that's the server on which this web server runs is also running other virtual machines, transparent to you. So they took a whole set of servers and they said we can put that all on one machine, okay, because that machine has all of the resources. Okay. So that's data center environment. The other place where this is used is cloud computing. Okay. This is something we will see as we do some of the labs. Okay. Cloud computing essentially is a data center where you can rent resources, okay, rather than buying resources. So if you need a machine to run a research experiment for 2 days, the old way is somebody has to buy a machine for you, you run it, you run your experiment, and once you're done with the experiment, maybe it will sit idle until your next research deadline, or something. Or you go and borrow a machine from someone else and return. What cloud computing is allowing you to do is whenever you have transient needs, temporary needs, rather than buying, you rent. You see, you can rent a machine by the hour, the cloud computing environment. The charges are hourly. So you can pay 10 cents an hour just to get a machine for it. So you run it for 3 hours only. If that's all you need to run your experiment, you only pay for 3 hours. So you could finish your experiment in $1 rather than spending $1,000 to buy a machine to do your experiment. So for many dynamic workloads or transient needs, cloud computing is more cost effective than buying equipment. Renting is cheaper than buying. You want to rent for short periods of time. Okay, if you buy, you're stuck with that machine for the lifetime. You can't just get rid of it. Okay, you paid for it, so you keep it around. Okay, but it's sitting there unused. Okay, so the money is not being spent very cost effectively. Here, you basically can just go and rent resources. And the way the cloud provider is implementing renting of resources is through virtualization. So when you say, go give me a virtual machine, they give you give me a server, they give you a virtual machine, they don't give you a physical machine. Okay? The reason is they don't trust you. Because you are some unknown customer showed up and says, I need a machine. They need a way to give it to you and yet not have you do arbitrary malicious thing and take their system down. So what they do is they control the hypervisor. The cloud provider will actually own the hypervisor and the machine. They'll create a virtual machine and give you root access on that virtual machine. So whatever you do is restricted to what you can damage you can do to the virtual machine. You can't actually do anything to the physical machine because that's controlled by the hypervisor. Okay? So this allows you to put untrusted customer applications on the servers and not have the arbitrarily bad things happen. Okay? If you rented actual physical machine, then your system may go haywire if the customer runs some code that has bugs or worse, that machine is hacked, your entire system gets hacked. Here, the virtual machine gets hacked because the customer did not do something right. Only that virtual machine is impacted, not the rest of the network. Because you have isolated resources and allocate only a certain amount of resources. Yeah, so it's an attractive way to implement renting resources while retaining control and having some level of security. Yeah, so that's how cloud computing works. And we'll come back to that later on. Of course, the last example of virtualization is actually desktop computing. There are two forms. As the one that we already talked about, this is you run a type 2 hypervisor. You have a Windows machine, you need to run Linux for doing some experiment, doing some research. Rather than going and getting another machine to run Linux, you can just get a type 2 hypervisor. There are some free ones like VirtualBox, and you can run Linux on your Windows machine. And you get all the advantages of running Linux without having to buy a second machine. Okay, so this is used for software development quite a bit. Okay, so you can develop one platform or another, or do testing on inside the virtual machine without having it impact the physical machine and so on. Okay, so testing is a big example. When you do software development, you may need machines to test your code. You can just bring up some virtual machine test and then decommission them once you're done. Then you can run applications from another platform and so on. Okay. That's one example of using virtualization for desktop computing. Another example is what is called using thin clients and using virtualized desktops. Okay, so in this case, rather than actually running your PC on your machine, your PC is essentially a virtual machine sitting in a cloud or some data center somewhere. Okay, so you can run Windows on a virtual machine on some remote server, and you use some terminal application to connect to. You can use remote desktop, for example, or in the Linux world or Mac world, you can use VNC to connect to it. Okay. So in this case, the desktop is not on your physical machine, it's out on a server somewhere. Okay. Many enterprises are switching to this model because it's easier to manage. If you want to actually install, let's say, virus signature or update virus signature, rather than physically going this and doing this on PCs, all the PCs are actually virtualized, are sitting on a stack of servers in one location. All users are actually connecting to that using a remote desktop application. So for many environments, that's good because you don't have to deal with actually managing physical machines. The supermarket checkout terminals, that's a PC there. Okay, but if the PC was actually running somewhere, the IT could be centralized. Management of these machines could be centralized. You don't have to go to every store and install updates or software patches and things like that. So you can just do this centrally. That's another example of using virtualization in more of the desktop environment. So this technology has become popular. There are many different use cases, as you will see here, and you will encounter some of this as we go along this course. There is going to be some lectures on cloud computing. Okay, so we will come back to some of these ideas of that. Okay, so I will switch gears and start a different topic, but I'm going to pause for a second and see if there are any questions on virtualization. Any question? Any people here who use Amazon clouds already? Okay, so some small subset. We'll try to have at least one assignment that involves a cloud in this course. So by the end of the class, at least everybody should have touched Amazon and encountered what either virtualization or cloud does for you. Okay? All right. Oh, there is one more slide I forget. So there's a case study on virtualization, which is not what I presented on the previous slide. This is the Planet Lab case study. The people here heard of Planet Lab? Okay. So Planet Lab is essentially a distributed set of machines contributed by many different universities across the world that are used for research. Okay. So if you need to run, let's say you're a networking student, you need to run some experiment, and you need a set of machines at different locations. Okay. You can actually go to Planet Lab and say, I need some 10 machines and I need them distributed across 10 sites. It will allocate you 10 machines at 10 different locations. Okay, the way they do this is through virtualization. So they have these physical machines sitting at literally hundreds of different locations. They are centrally managed. So when you go and say, I need so many sites, they create a new virtual machine on each of those, and they give you access. Say, here, this is the machine you will access, and this is the virtual machine at site 1, virtual machine at site 2, site 3, and so on. Okay, so it's a very good use of use of virtualization to do research experiments with a set of machines that people have all contributed, and you can do research on either distributed systems or networking. Okay, so they are used for these two in these two areas quite a bit. Okay, so the way they have instrumented Planet Lab is they have used OS level virtualization. The reason I put this case study is all of the others have actually done hardware level virtualization, type 1 or type 2 hypervisor. Planet Lab went with OS level virtualization. So they are essentially giving you a container. That's what I mentioned last time. If you remember, I talked about Solaris containers and Linux or BSD-Js. So they give you a slice of the machine as is shown here. So containers on Linux can be, you run this thing called a vServer, a virtual server, can create a slice of the machine. So when you log into that virtual server, it looks like a physical machine, but it's not, it's basically a virtual server. Virtualized at the OS level. Okay, so you're not running another OS in there. You're actually using the underlying OS itself, but you basically get an isolated container with a limited amount of RAM, a limited amount of CPU, and so on. So you can run your experiment without impacting other experiments that may be running, belonging to other users. Okay. So you're still carving out your server and giving it to different users, okay, who may be independent and may be running different experiments. Okay. So this is how clearly you could have done hardware level virtualization as well, just as you do in the cloud computing environment. Okay. But they chose to do it at the OS level because it's more efficient. You can run more virtual servers on a given set of hardware than you could run virtual machines. Because inside each virtual machine, you have to run a new kernel. So there's more overhead. So if you have n virtual machines, you have n kernels. Okay. In OS level virtualization, there's only one kernel. And each of these is essentially a container that is just isolating resources. You don't run another kernel. Okay. So a bit more efficient. Okay. And this is sort of what is happening in Planet Lab. So if you haven't used, some of you might use it as part of your work or research, and you will then understand how Planet Lab works as well. Okay. It's using virtualization, but at the OS level. Okay. So we have a few minutes. I'm going to start this new topic on code and process migration, and we'll continue it on Wednesday because we won't get through all of the material. Okay? There's a new chapter in the book, okay? So keep up with the readings, otherwise we'll fall behind. Okay? So over the course of the last 2 or 3 lectures, we talked about distributed scheduling. Okay? So we are done with the scheduling chapter now. We did uniprocessor, multiprocessor scheduling, distributed scheduling, and virtualization, which is a form of managing resources, not exactly scheduling, but a form of managing resources. In the course of that process, we saw that you might have to migrate processes as part of doing distributed scheduling. I'll also talk about migrating entire virtual machines as part of scheduling as well in this chapter. Okay? So, and I said we'll come back to this topic and we'll try to understand a little deeper, go into a little more depth, understand how process migration is going to work and so on. Okay? So that's what we are going to look at here. Okay? So why do migration? There are 2 reasons. You want to have performance and flexibility. You migrate processes and you use that to do load balancing, you get better performance. There's also more flexibility on where your code runs. It's not bound to the machine where it started. It can run on another machine and give you the result. Okay? So in the context of this discussion, we are going to distinguish between what we call process migration and code migration. Okay? So what process migration, which is also referred to as strong mobility, means that it's a real process that's already running on an OS that is being moved to another machine. Okay? In code migration, you're essentially shipping the code to another machine and it starts up as a new process when it begins execution. Okay. Code migration can only be done before the process begins executing. After you submit your request saying start this application or run this application, your choice is you can take the code binary of that application, transfer it to another machine and start the process there. That's called code migration. If you actually start up the code here, it becomes a process and then you migrate it, that's process migration. So as you can imagine, process migration is more complicated because it's already a running process. It has state, it has address space, it has resources executing. You have to transfer all of that over and resume execution on another machine. Code migration is somewhat simpler, also referred to as weak mobility. It's somewhat simpler because you have the flexibility to actually move the code and execute the program on another machine if the code doesn't already exist there. If it exists there, then there's nothing to move. You just start the process on that machine. Okay. So you will see there is code migration is also more common than process migration as a result, because process migration is more complicated. It's only used in certain scenarios. Code migration is actually common, far more common than you actually think. So there are lots of things you do that fall under this category. Okay. So filling forms on a web browser is an example of code migration. The reason being, essentially, your code, you can basically, as part of form filling, your browser can actually download some JavaScript code that does some checks as you fill. It may say that this field is required, you didn't fill it out, or the phone number has to be in a certain format, you forgot to put dashes in your phone number. All that checks are actually done in your browser. The server has actually sent some code over to you, to your browser. The browser is doing these checks. So you could have written that application where you take the form, the data in the form, send it to the browser does the checks and sends back the errors. Rather than doing that, the server sent you some code. The code is running in your browser. The code is actually running in the context of your browser and it's basically doing these checks. One very simple example of code migration. Java applets, which are not very common anymore, are also another example of code migration. And the Java applet is a piece of code that resides on the server. When you want to execute this applet, you download the code moves over a network, and it executes on your local machine, perhaps as a new process, or perhaps as in the context of your browser process. Okay, another example of code migration. Okay. You can also send queries off to server. Okay, so if you construct a query and you send it off to a server, that's a small piece of program that's actually moving to the server to execute. That's an example of code migration. Okay, so any query, it could be a standard SQL query or it could be something very simple like a keyword search. Okay. So either of these two actually basically is a query that you are sending. So you wrote a tiny program, you sent it off to the server, the program traversed the network, executed at the server and got back the result. Okay. Another example of code migration. Yeah, so it's the thing to keep in mind that it is a common in many different scenarios, even though you don't think of it as migrating code and so on. Okay. There are many scenarios where this already exists. Okay. Here is another example of code migration where you are dynamically configuring a system by downloading drivers. Okay. So now I think the latest version of Windows and definitely the latest version of Mac OS X has the ability to download drivers on the fly. Okay. So you plug in a piece of hardware. If this hardware has been plugged into this machine for the first time, the OS will say this hardware, or let's say it's a printer. Okay, just as an example, the OS will say that you need a driver to make this printer work. Can I go download the driver for you? If you say yes, it will go to some driver repository somewhere, okay, and it will identify the model of the printer. And if that driver is already available from the repository, you download it, and then it configures that driver on the fly, and your printer is ready to work. Okay. It's an example of code migration because the code that you need to run for this application, which is of printing, resides in some code repository. In this case, this happens to be drivers, but this example can be used in other contexts as well. So you download code on demand, as and when needed, and you use it. And when you are done, you can even throw the driver away. You can just decommission the driver after the hardware is unplugged. So that's another example of code migration. In this case, you are dynamically configuring your machine on the fly. You don't need to have all the drivers sitting on your machine. Okay, a priori. Neither do you need the user to show up when they come with the new piece of hardware to bring a driver with them. The OS will get it for you, okay, and configure your system. Okay, so that's motivation for why these techniques are important and where they are used. We'll talk a little bit about how this works, and then we just have a few minutes, so I'm going to basically stop today. Okay, so the thing to keep in mind, because we are going to talk about both process migration as well as code migration, we have to keep certain things in mind. Okay, when we talk about processes, we'll assume that there is an address space, there's a memory region for that process that consists at least of a code segment, this is the binary instructions for that process, a resource segment, and a stack. So this could be a stack segment or a heap segment. Okay, so there are basically code segment, stack segment, heap segment. There are at least these three things in every process. There may be other segments. So if you are migrating your process, you need to transfer all of these segments over and instantiate it in the context of a new process. How to do that, we will see. But you have to realize that those are the things that need to move from one machine to another for the process to continue executing. When you transfer code, you don't need to deal with all that. You are just transferring either a script or it's a driver which could be binary code, and you just bring it over and you execute. There's no process yet. The process is instantiated after the code moves. So those are things to keep in mind. So in weak mobility, the transferred program starts from an initial state. We will also distinguish between sender-initiated and receiver-initiated migration. Who initiated the migration? Okay, is it the sender pushed some code to you, let's say execute this, or the receiver asked for some code? Okay. When you download an applet in your browser, that's receiver initiated. You go and ask for the applet saying download this, and then I'm going to execute it. Okay, or the server, then maybe I'll talk about scenarios where the server will push some code to you. Like when you are doing form filling, the server pushed some JavaScript to you in the page, and then the code came over and you executed that. That's sender initiated. You did not request that. Okay, it came as part of your form filling code. Okay, so there are many different forms of mobility, or many different dimensions. We will look at this in more detail next time, but for now the things to keep in mind is there's a difference between migrating a process and migrating code and starting the process using the migrated code. Okay. Process migration is more complicated. There are a lot more details to work out to make it work. Code migration is much simpler. Regardless of whether you do process or code migration, you have to think about who triggers the migration. Is it coming from the receiver or the sender, the request to migrate the code? And we'll see how these various dimensions can be combined to form different point solutions in this whole space. Okay, but that's coming next time. We are going to stop here for